Okay.
Hi, Camille.
Hi, Maury.
Thanks for being with me today and
Well,
hanging.
thank you for this wonderful opportunity to talk about the power of music.
Yes.
So I am currently a podcaster. I've been hosting the Camille Conte show for 10 years, though I've been an Anchorage broadcaster for 40 years, award-winning broadcaster. I'm also an author. I wrote a book called The Confusion Experiment, and I created a transformational program called Ready for Change.
Awesome.
Yeah.
How did this whole career come to be, and what fueled your passion for rock?
Well, I grew up in a musical household. My father was a drummer and the band leader for a big band called the Rock Conte Orchestra. So there was always music playing in my house. I grew up with all the great singers, Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett, and the big band sounds. And then, of course, my sisters turned me on to rock and roll. So I was the kind of family where on 4th of July holidays, my father and his brother and the other guys in the band would set up in the driveway and play live music. So that was my norm, and it was a pretty wonderful and rare experience. So I've been in love with music from a very young age.
Yeah. What was your first record?
The first record I can remember is Build Me Up, Buttercup, which was a 45, and we had a record player, the portable record player, and I took the top off and dropped the needle on Build Me a Buttercup, which is a great song by the band, I think, The Foundations. The first album I remember is Rubber Soul by the Beatles.
Oh, wow.
And seeing those 4 pictures of John, Paul, George, and Ringo on the front cover with their mop hair and just going, wow, what is this? I just did Black Music History Month in February and really dove deep into not just the artists, but their backgrounds and their lives and the kind of childhoods that they had. And it was really inspiring, not just to see that people have overcome incredible suffering to go on and be the light that they are in the world, like, someone like, Stevie Wonder, or even James Brown, who was born in a shack with no running water, nothing, like laying on dirt as his bed, had an abusive father, and as a result spent a lot of time in the woods and just by himself. But as a result of that, he was able to tap into who he is and was able to understand how his mind works, and just had epiphanies that you usually don't have at such a young age that fueled his career as a phenomenal artist. So for me, Motown is just worthy of lots of hours to talk about, because it's not just a record company, and it's not just a family of artists that record company brought together, but it's also a genre. It's also a particular sound that has a very colorful thread in the American music tapestry.
Yeah, definitely. And then from there we move on and we see so much influence from that era.
For sure.
So can you keep going with the timeline?
Yeah, well, I mean, Motown was happening during the British invasion. So, 63, 64, 65, when everybody from London and the UK, they're taking up the blues music. The Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, Led Zeppelin, they were all mesmerized by the blues sound and the artists that were making it. So when Jimi Hendrix was just coming onto the scene, he was over in London. And the buzz was out about him, and Eric Clapton and Mick Jagger and all those guys are in the audience. But what did they do when they have a chance to talk to him? They talked to him about, tell us about the blues artists, tell us about black music in particular. So a lot of these things were happening all at the same time. And when you look at the charts and the hits that were happening while the British invasion was happening, there's Motown with all these. I mean, Stevie Wonder came on the scene when he was 11. Okay. Nowadays, we don't blink an eye at a young kid, even younger than 11, singing or playing an instrument. But back in the early 60s, that was an anomaly. Like, that just didn't happen. So that is all in the mixing pot right around the same time. I think things really take a shift when you get into 1970, because that's on the heels of the Beatles breaking up, which created a massive vacuum. You know, you have to really remember that the Beatles dominated the charts. They were a phenomenon like nobody had ever seen before. And they were recording one great album after another. I mean, the amount of creativity that was flowing through those four incredibly talented men. You look back on it now, you're like, wow. Plus, they were in something new. Record companies, that was a new thing, right? Dabbling with sound effects, playing the tape backwards.
Right. Yeah.
All revolutionary approaches to what came before them, which was the singer with the band, you know, behind them. So 1970, I would say rock officially kind of comes onto the scene, but as does the female singer-songwriter. And now I'm doing Women's History, Music History Month inside the month of March. And we looked at the rock stars like Janis Joplin and Grace Slick and the challenges that they had, even finding male musicians to play in their band. Why? Because that was cutting edge. To have a female front a rock band, that had never really happened before. There were female singers, but a rock band, they were either, you know, backup singers or roadies, right?
Right.
So, you know, they had tough times finding guys whose egos were in check and wanted to be a part of something that was new, which was the female rock star. But then you have people like Carole King and Joni Mitchell. You have the folk women who came onto the scene, Joan Baez, who befriends Bob Dylan. And the power of folk music to hold the mirror up to what was happening in society at the time in a way that I think will, you know, live on. The musical soundtrack to those civil rights days and what was happening to our brothers and sisters in the South, and the March on Washington with Martin Luther King, and Bob Dylan played there. You know, there are pictures of him, you know, at the little podium there, playing his guitar. And there's Joan Baez, you know, getting up there and singing, "The Answer, My Friend, is Blowing in the Wind." So, you know, folk music, I think, really took the lead in being that mirror to social activism. And starting to, certainly Pete Seeger, you know, the father of perhaps the folk movement, was already doing things like that. But I think it reached a mass population by the time the civil rights movement was happening, and people were using music as a way to communicate the frustration of what was happening and the disparity that they were seeing on the streets. You add to that the Vietnam War and bands like Creedence Clearwater Revival, that's pretty much used in almost every Vietnam War movie that's out there. They were the soundtrack. You know, Fortunate Son, a song about a kid that goes to the war because he's not a fortunate son of a congressman who doesn't have to go through the draft and be drafted into the Vietnam War. Then you go into the murders at Kent State, where those 4 innocent college kids were gunned down. And you've got Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, who are just starting to form and take off. They literally go right into the studio and take that anger that we feel today and compose a song like Ohio, 4 Dead in Ohio. So the 70s are a very powerful time. And, you know, 1973, there were so many incredible albums that came out. Quadrophenia from The Who, Dark Side of the Moon from Pink Floyd. I mean, the first albums that were monumental in their sound and just, you know, planted that flag on the rock and roll moon, so to speak, in ways that were unprecedented. So it was I grew up with the 70s music. I certainly was exposed to what was happening in the 60s, but I was pretty young. But my teenage years took me into the 70s, and so I cut my teeth on that 70s sound, which also saw the emergence of female rockers. You know, you have Janis Joplin and Grace Slick, but then came Patti Smith, who brought the punk sound. And that whole thing that was going on in New York City, the new wave movement with Blondie and you know, Patti Smith, and, you know, women that were expressing themselves in ways that we had never heard before. When you hear about how the women in the Motown era were singing about boys, that's exactly how they were singing about them. But when Janis Joplin comes onto the scene, and Grace Slick, Grace Slick singing, "I want somebody to love. I need somebody to love." We had never heard women proclaiming their sexuality and their desires in such a blatant way. So that was also very, very powerful as women started to nudge their way through that male-dominated crowd and take their place at center stage. And that's why I do these history months, especially Women's History Month, because all the women today who are effortlessly equal to their male counterparts can give credit to the women who came through the 60s and the 70s that put up with things that they're probably still putting up with, but probably not to the degree that women in the 70s and 80s were putting up to.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, very powerful time.
For sure.
Well, that is one of the topics that is a choice for the independent study. So hopefully some of you might riff off of what Camille is saying here. What about psychedelic music? Do you like it? What was that all about?
Well, I think psychedelic music is a very broad name, and it could include a lot of different people.
Sure.
Jimi Hendrix, for sure, psychedelic.
Yeah.
What that man did with his guitar, to this day, people still don't understand. I don't know if he was the first, but he could very have well been the first person to ever use his teeth as a guitar pick. Okay?
Yeah,
like we think of, and the precision of that playing is out of this world. So what he was doing with his guitar, I think, was very, very much, psychedelic music. Then you have a band literally called the Psychedelic Furs, right?
Yeah.
And some of the way it morphed into punk and into new wave. Even some of the artists coming through the 70s, those Motown artists like the Temptations and some of these bands that kept growing and kept moving through the musical genres that were exploding at the time, which I think made them really interesting. They were able to do that My Guy sound or My Girl, but then they're also doing like Papa Was a Rolling Stone and Ball of Confusion, which to me incorporated some of that psychedelic sound in the very early stages. So that's the beauty of the 70s, extremely experimental. And again, when the Beatles broke up, you realize just how big, how much space they took up as this band on the scene, and how much space was available after they kind of withdrew. And so many people were like, wow, there's room. There's room for the singer-songwriter, the folk person, the women, and all of the things that we're talking about. I don't know that I got a whole lot more into psychedelic music outside of what rock and roll was doing with that psychedelic sound. Pink Floyd, some people consider a lot of their work to be a bit psychedelic. So it's a broad term. Well, the Stones were mimicking and literally covering American blues music. So in the very beginning of their career, when Mick Jagger is like 19 years old, with those incredible eyes and lips and hair, they're singing American blues music, like Little Red Rooster and some of the really old blues music. They don't start writing their own music, I think, like 2 or 3 albums in.
Right.
So that was part of what a band had to do back then. First, they had to kind of find their chops, and they would cover songs that were popular at the time, I think, to kind of work those components out. And as they got more and more comfortable with themselves and their craft, they were able to, and of course they'd have producers who were encouraging, they were able to, write their own music. But I think the Beatles really were pop. In the very beginning, the Beatles were doing 2.5-minute songs, like Love Me Do, and they were all very successful pop songs. it was not until later on, like the White Album or the Magical Mystery Tour album, where they themselves were experimenting with a lot of sounds and moved more into that rock sound. If you haven't seen that Get Back documentary, that is a really important, though long, it's a really important history lesson just for them and a particular time period that they were in. So I don't know that they were necessarily rivals. Of course, it's just from my own summation of all my years hanging out with all this music.
Yeah.
I think that they were feeding off of each other in very healthy ways. Even the band Cream, you know, or these super groups where people were coming together after leaving groups to make these trios of super talented people like Ginger Baker and Eric Clapton, who made the band Cream before they broke up. And you have the Yardbirds and Graham Nash, who was with the Hollies but was getting bored, and then the mystical ways in which David Crosby and Stephen Stills see Graham Nash in Los Angeles, and they're like, wow, who's this guy? Because he was an unknown, because the Hollies were a very particular sounding band. But back to your thoughts about the Beatles and the Stones, I think that they drew on each other, and I think that they were a part of a very supportive network in the beginning, because they all came out of that same area. I mean, the story of how George Harrison met Paul McCartney is just one for the record books. And for me, it's a very mystical, it's mystical to me. It's like in the soup of the cosmos already, that these interactions happened and these meetings happened, because you look at it and you go, well, what are the odds? What are the odds that Elton John is going to be handed a stack of envelopes that represent songwriters, and the top one is Bernie Taupin? What are the odds that he's going to pull out the very first song, and it's your song, and he sits down and without a second's hesitation, boom, plays out the song to the lyrics, and they're still creating together. So that's why, to me, that's why music is really special to me. It's really powerful. It's really important. It's really healing, for sure. Protest songs. Yeah, so David Crosby of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young just passed away, and in one of the articles I was reading, he was talking about the importance of protest songs, and he actually co-wrote or participated in a book about social activism and music. And to me, that's always been an important element of music. Whether an artist is representing me, like when I first met Bruce Springsteen in 1978, I was 16. And the first album I heard was Darkness on the Edge of Town. And all the angst I was feeling and all the ways in which I felt trapped in the tiny town I grew up in, I heard in those songs. I heard in his voice. So for me, he was a personal activist for me. But as we were talking earlier with regards to some of the things that happened at Kent State or with the Vietnam War, David Crosby was recently saying we need more activist music. We need more protest songs. Like when George Floyd was murdered.
Yeah.
We took to the streets, but I don't know that we had a unifying song. And he was saying how important it is for us to have some more protest songs that we can sing together and unify ourselves with. Because, that's the other thing about music. It unified. Where there was separation between blacks and whites, not on the dance floor. When Motown came on the scene and you're looking at the pictures, white and black kids are dancing together to the same music. When the lights go down in an arena, it doesn't matter your affiliation or your politics or anything, because we're all there to be lifted up by the power and the joy of music. So I am all for anyone creating more protest songs that empower us and unify us. Like Keisha, for the documentary on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's got a great song called, I think it's called Change, as does Mavis Staples, who still writing great songs. She's working with Ben Harper. She's out on the road with a bunch of really talented people doing festival work. Just a couple years ago, she put out this great album, and she also had a song about the need for change. So I hope that this generation, the next generations, any generation that's not mine, is finding something like that for their artists that they can hang a hat on and go, wow, that's a song for the soundtrack of my life. That's a song that resonates with what I'm going through today, whether it's economic or social or whatever topic it may be that people are going through. I think certainly rap music and certainly hip hop came out of that.
Yes.
Holding the mirror up to what was happening to the inner cities and minorities, in general, and it still remains a really important genre today for sure.
Yeah. And that is, there have been comments, made by people in the class that as we started looking at the protest songs of the 70s, that current day, you have artists who are definitely making statements and saying things, but not in a way to unify. It's almost making things more marginalized and separated, and there's a lot of complaining going on.
Right.
But what about the coming together? And there aren't really, you can't really name a lot of artists that are doing that.
That's correct. Yeah. And it's important because music is history. Music is history, at least in my experience. If I want to know what happened in the 50s, in the 60s, and in the 70s, I can look in a history book, but I can also go back and start playing songs.
Right.
Because they tell me what was happening.
Yes.
The good as well as the challenging times. Look, so first and foremost, music is powerful. Music can heal. Music can comfort. Music can make someone feel a joy and an elevated sense of themselves that you cannot get anywhere else. Maybe artificially through drugs, maybe through lovemaking, but music is so powerful. So at the same time that it can lift you, it can also take you down because music is a frequency. Music has a vibrational frequency to it. And so it's understandable why if a young person or anybody is listening to dark music over and over and over again, it's going to affect them, especially if they're already challenged with their emotions or their mental health. I have somebody I work with who likes that that music where, and this is how I say it, where the lead singer is screaming for the entire song. And I say, that's not singing, that's screaming. And he says, no, you're wrong, that's singing. So that's a beautiful thing because he loves it and I don't. For me, when Roger Daltrey screamed, it was a punctuation. When Robert Plant, did his howl, it was a punctuation. And it did something to a song that was specific and in the moment, but it wasn't the duration of the song. So I literally can't hear those songs because it's very aggressive to my hearing. As much as I try to stay open to music, but and also, that kind of rage, heavy dark metal that you're talking about is it wears the skin of anger. Like the singers and the bands, they're inside the clothing of anger. So whether it's literally because they themselves are needing that expression or someone who's listening, their anger is being validated by that expression. I've heard all of that. It's very male. It's very what I would call testosterone filled. I don't see, though I know they exist, I have not seen a lot of women, females in that genre. My friend's son is a singer in a band that does that kind of genre. But yeah, I'm not surprised that there have been suicides and acts of violence because someone is exposing themselves to that. The same thing happens with videos or movies. If you don't have the maturity to filter things out or to be able to go, oh, that's just a song, it can take on a life of its own,
right,
as you and within you. So, do I think it's music? No. Is that biased from my personal upbringing? Yes. Just like a young person may hear my music and go, that's just ridiculous. What is that? And that's the beauty, of variety.
What about punk?
Punk, I think punk expressed angst. And I think there's a slight nuance between angst and anger. Not to say that punk didn't represent anger, but because it did. You've got the Clash and others in the punk movement that were clearly talking about the disparity that was happening economically, and you certainly can hear anger in punk. But it's different. And I guess I'd have to think a little bit about why I think punk is different from this metal sound. I think part of why punk was different is that the music wasn't as aggressive as it is now. That it was aggressive, but it wasn't aggressive in the way that I hear it today. But again, I'd have to think on this, because as I'm talking, I'm questioning whether I'm being totally accurate about punk. But punk was really important because, again, punk represented a group of people who were having a specific societal experience that needed musical representation. So the kids who were living, in poor inner cities, or the kids in the UK that were socially shunned, or whose parents could not stabilize themselves economically. Punk was really important, for sure. But there's even some punk sounds that I guess I didn't really stay with long enough to say, yeah, I know a lot about punk and I've listened to a ton of punk. I was right across the river from New York City when punk and new wave was happening. So I am familiar with the bands and the sounds, but there was a mishmash going on with new wave as well. Blondie, not so much, punk. Patti Smith, I think, was definitely more punk than new wave. We had never heard a woman sing like the way Patti Smith sings. Even to this day, the ear can reject it because of our preconceived notions about a woman and how she's supposed to sound and how she's supposed to sing. Sure. Patti Smith came on, people were like, not only just because of how she looked, but it was like that voice. We had never heard a woman sing angrily like she did. But she did.
Yeah, interesting. And then the grunge movement, and I actually like a lot of grunge music because they seem to be expressing similar ideas to punk, and yet there is a musical sophistication. And a really aesthetically, Kurt Cobain, was a great singer. Soundgarden, fantastic singers. But still expressing the frustration and negative emotions of what they were going through in society.
Yeah, and I would almost use that phrase "wall of sound" for grunge music, because it does sometimes offer a density that comes from all the guitars. And it's very guitar forward, and just the way the chords are played. They're tight, dense chords versus open chords that are more associated with like pop and maybe a lighter sound. So you've got that sound that's coming out of grunge, but I do think you're right when you talk about it being a more sophisticated production, put together, whereas some of those other genres you're speaking about don't have that quality. And maybe that's inherently because they're not supposed to. But the ear does pick it up.
Right.
For me and you.
With the punk bands that are so theatrical. Throwing themselves everywhere.
Exactly.
It's like you can't really have musical sophistication.
Yeah. Iggy Pop was a big punk guy. Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders. She was walking that fine line of punk and rock, And then you got to throw a band like Queen into the mix with somebody like Freddie Mercury, who also was a genius, was a creative genius, and was pulling from classical music. Bohemian Rhapsody. Who has ever created anything quite like that since? Nobody. And so Yeah, I think I wonder what Queen would be sounding like today if Freddie Mercury was still alive. Maybe their trajectory would have taken them into some of that grunge sound, because it was in some of those earlier songs before we had a label for it. You know.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Can you talk about who you like to listen to now? Who is current that you really like?
I have a segment on my show, the Camille Conte show, called the New Music Spotlight. Because like I always say, even Jimi Hendrix was a nobody. It took someone going to a show in a bar, at a club, and then going and telling their friends the next day, I saw this guy last night, I think his name's right, or a radio station, turning us on to new music. So to me, that will always be a really important part of what I do, not just because I love it myself, and I want to know who's good and new, but as a DJ, so to speak, I want to make sure my listeners are keeping themselves tuned in to what good is good and new. So we love the classics, and for us it is some of the greatest music that has ever been made because we grew up with it. But some of the new people that I particularly love are this band Kario, Kario. And they had a song that came out last year called Captive. Of course, Florence and the Machine is, she is just incredible. You talk about a spiritual experience. You look at any video of her shows, wow. Not only is she running around with any shoes, but she has this thing I think she calls the prayer aisle, where she is, having clearly religious and spiritual experiences with her audience right there in the front row. It's quite amazing. She is really good. There's a band called the 502s. That's really fantastic. I love the Killers. I love the band Spoon. Yeah. Now, will they last 30, 40, 50 years? Well, we've yet to see. I certainly won't see that. But I hope for them and their listeners that they have that lasting creativity and that lasting power to grow up with a generation and experience themselves evolving as an artist. I mean, we look at Taylor Swift. She just started, her tour, doing like 40 songs, 3+ hours. That's a lot of songs. That's a long show. But she has that staying power, clearly. Very talented woman. Yeah, extremely talented.
And Bruce Springsteen, who you just saw recently.
Yeah, sure. 73 years old. All the boys in the band are either late 60s or early 70s. And they're still a great rock and roll band. They're masters at their craft. So they play very well together. They deliver a very solid rock and roll show. His voice, even though he's gone through surgery and whatnot, is still really solid. And they're having a pretty great time right now. Yeah, they're getting ready to head over to Europe, and they've got at least 2 years of touring in front of them.
2 years?
Yeah. Wow. Because for a lot of these bands, this could very well be the end of that type of touring. Right? I mean, you're hitting 73. Maybe not. Paul McCartney is going to be 80 in June, and he just completed a fantastic run. So I'm sure they'll want to do it as long as they can. That's why I always say, get out and see the bands. Don't wait for this wonderful opportunity.
Yeah. Any last words that you would want these young students to know? Some of them aspiring artists, I think. Some of them are singer-songwriters.
Well, I think if you're an artist, you simply have to commit to following your heart. You're here to capture the broadcast. Like, I call it the divine broadcast, but, a song puts parentheses around nothing and creates something. And sometimes you have to have a life of, or, you have to spend time alone, you have to be comfortable being alone, but whatever it is for you, just follow your path and follow your heart and follow your inspiration, no matter what's happening. Because a lot of times people have to conform to feel like they are going to be a success, or that's what they're told they have to do. But it's always about coming back to who you really are and allowing those people who resonate with that to follow you. And as far as those of us who just love music, just continue to support local artists. I think that's super important. Local artists, local venues. You know, wherever you are here in Anchorage, we do have some venues, we do have local bands. Get out and support them. You know, download their music, put $10 in the tip jar. Help our local artists feel seen and supported by the community. And just can always stretch your ears to go outside of the genres that you particularly love. Go back to big band, go back to Motown, dabble in some of these artists that your parents maybe still have the records for, and see what it was that captivated a whole generation for so many years.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's exactly what this course is doing.
And tune into the Camille Conte Show.
Yes, everybody.
And check out what I do. You can find me at Mixcloud, as well as the Facebook at the Camille Conte Show.
And on Sundays?
Sundays at 6 o'clock, KNBA, 90.3 FM rebroadcasts my podcast. So I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, check it out, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
it was
Professor
so great
Hahn.
to have you.
Thank you very much.